So if you've been following the news, you know that the military conflict in Ukraine continues today. That began with Russia in 2014, and it continues today with an official ceasefire. The origins of the conflict include the Euromaidan, and this was a peaceful protest movement that began in November of 2013 in response to former President Yanukovych, his backing out of a trade association agreement that would bring Ukraine closer to the European Union. On the left, you can see one of the symbols used, and it's a Ukrainian crest combined with the flag of the European Union. And this was a symbol for the increased social, political, and economic integration that Ukraine was hoping for with the West. When the president fled office, the Russian military began stationed along the eastern border of Ukraine, and Russia annexed the Crimea Peninsula. So the eastern border is outlined in the yellow box. And since that time in 2014, 9,000 people have been killed and 20,000 wounded. The results of the conflict are also twofold, social and economic. Economically, in 2014, the value of the Ukrainian currency dropped 70% in comparison to the dollar, and the GDP fell by 7%. In 2014, the IMF approved a $17 billion loan program for Ukraine to stave off default in light of the military conflict. Since that time, billions more have come in economic aid in addition to humanitarian aid. Socially, 1.5 million people were internally displaced, as well as another 500,000 people who became refugees abroad. The motivations for movement out of the region outlined before include security threats, so there was a lack of formal government there, as well as humanitarian needs, a lack of water, food, electricity, and medical care. So in terms of demographics, most of the people, 95% of internally displaced people, are originating from the gray area in the eastern region, and only 5% originate from the Crimean Peninsula. 52% of internally displaced people have remained in the east, as you can see by the proportionally larger green circles in the east, and 59% of internally displaced people are pensioners, meaning that they already rely on government aid for a main part of their income. Finally, when relocating, most people have either paid rent for residences designed for them or have stayed with family, and only 10% are staying in specifically government-formed free communities. Ultimately, their needs include physical needs such as housing, food, and clothing, as well as more long-term needs such as education, professional counseling, and psychological aid. The needs have been addressed by a coordinated effort of international organizations such as the UN, the government, including the federal government and local government, as well as internal and local NGOs and volunteer groups. So for my project, I traveled to Ukraine, to Kyiv, the capital, and Lviv, marked by the two circles in yellow. And I spoke to representatives of each of these groups, gauging their respective impact in helping internally displaced people in these regions. So first I spoke to representatives of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and they focus most of their work on the east because that is where the majority of IDPs are located. And there they work with local NGOs to maximize their efforts and their success. Their work is under an umbrella of two main goals, the protection cluster and the shelter and non-food items cluster. The protection cluster includes securing the rights of internally displaced people for registration and financial aid, as well as legal and psychological support, and making sure that they are compensated for any medical expenses. The shelter and non-food items cluster includes bedding as well as repairing broken down shelters in the region. They've also been key in this non-government controlled region that is shown here in blue because the government has no access to the region, meaning that it cannot provide humanitarian aid there and therefore relies on UN representatives. One of the main issues here and concerns was that of the restriction of movement, where many of the people weren't able to leave the area. And in this case, the UN was instrumental in providing these people with acknowledging their legal status as internally displaced people and providing them with documents for movement and travel outside of the border and to regions of safety. When I spoke to the federal government, I spoke specifically to representatives of the Ministry of Health and the Committee on Foreign Affairs. The Ministry of Health's main goals were generally to create a protocol for mental trauma and post-traumatic stress that is addressing the needs of both internally displaced people as well as of veterans coming back from the front, and to increase training for specialization in these fields. The Committee on Foreign Affairs acknowledged the immense amount of aid received from abroad, and in one of their best movements to increase efficiency of receiving this aid, they created a group that matched foreign organizations with local on-the-ground NGOs and volunteer groups doing the actual work to funnel the aid more efficiently. They also coordinated with the Ukrainian World Congress, and this is an international non-government organization that unites a diaspora of 20 million Ukrainians abroad in 34 nations. And these groups were critical in their countries, not only for fundraising for humanitarian aid, but also for lobbying Ukrainian interests abroad, specifically increasing and continuing economic sanctions against Russia. Next, I traveled to Kyiv, which is in western Ukraine, and there were 11,000 internally displaced people. There were over 700 families were displaced, and 9,500 of those displaced people were receiving aid from the government or volunteer organizations. The Department of Social Aid had multiple different initiatives to help them. First was financial aid, where these internally displaced people were given a monthly stipend, mostly for living expenses. Also, the Department of Social Aid provided housing, and this was through coordination with hostels, hotels, churches, and different already established public buildings where they were opened up space for internally displaced people. Finally, they created an unemployment center that provided jobs and employment for internally displaced people, as well as professional development programs with resume critiques and practice interviews to allow people to potentially pursue a different career path once they reach the West. This group also acknowledged the large volunteer contribution, specifically as it pertained to receiving foreign material aid from foreign humanitarian organizations, because volunteer groups do not have to undergo the same government bureaucracy that the local government has to. They are able to more easily declare and transport humanitarian aid materials across the border, making them crucial to helping the local people in western Ukraine. Finally, there's a lot of statistics and data on the large organizations helping, such as the UN or the EU, but there is not as much time and not as much credit given to local organizations such as Phoenix Wings or the Ukrainian Humanitarian Foundation that really did a lot of the on-the-ground work, working specifically with internally displaced people in local regions. One of these organizations that I spoke with more closely was the Kyiv Center for Volunteers, and this was an umbrella organization for multiple different initiatives. There were 30 full-time administrators and over 300 volunteers, and interestingly enough, over time, half of the volunteers were internally displaced people because they became very much involved in helping others who were also traveling to the West, given that they knew much of the hardships and much of the processes of integrating into this new city. And these umbrella organizations help everything from providing housing, financial aid, and any other forms of humanitarian aid such as food. They also help the families of those fighting in the East, and they do send materials to those fighting in the East, such as medicine and clothing. When I spoke to the head of the Center for Volunteers, he said that the beginning was the hardest part. Now nothing is a challenge, because aside from the immense challenge of finding housing for this large influx of thousands of people, there were a lot of social difficulties of reintegrating them and into a different society and to some extent a different culture. They had to overcome the large anti-Western propaganda that they were exposed to in the East. And not only that, but they had to overcome the misconceptions and misunderstandings when they were arriving to the West. A lot of them had expected social programs established by the governments already and waiting for them, meaning that they would have come in there having housing provided, shelter, food, clothing, and they were very shocked and surprised when they came and a lot of these systems were not already in place, and to find the local community scrambling to help them. To combat this, the Center for Volunteers did a lot of think tanks, discussion talks with internally displaced people themselves to give them a voice, to express their frustrations, validify them, and also show them that they are not helpless and that there is a community of people helping them. And they also organized events, outings, and soccer games between the families of internally displaced people as well as families of those fighting in the East. just to increase community and social cohesion between these two very initially different groups. So ultimately, everyone that I had interviewed, from the UN to the federal and local government, acknowledged and praised the large efforts of individual volunteer organizations. They said that we have seen hundreds of initiatives created in response, and that the work of volunteers was critical, and that they made a huge impact in helping internally displaced people. And this not only speaks to debase the, oftentimes what you hear as the social incohesion of Ukraine, that there's a divide linguistically and geographically between the East and the West. So this serves to show that this divide was, volunteers were able to overcome this divide in working with these people, and that in a time of crisis they were able to help them. Not only that, but this formation and this materialization of this civil society that began with the Euromaidan protests multiple years back is only increased by the number of aid and efforts of volunteers, and it will become critical in the next few